right. So, contingency argument. I know of all the arguments, it seems like, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's probably one of your favorite lines of argument is contingency.
Yeah, it is. It's the argument that really first got me interested in natural theology when I first even became aware that the question of God's existence was something that was argued about by philosophers, and that, through the grand tradition of philosophy, you see various types of arguments that fall under this style of argumentation. It's not really the contingency argument. It's like the contingency arguments. It's a family. It's a class of arguments. And we'll explain what that is in a minute. But no, this is the one that really first got my interest and eventually convinced me. I came to see, I think there is a sound contingency argument. It's the one that I've thought about the most. It's the one I continue to think about. And, years ago, I may have thought that, okay, there was probably maybe just one good argument for God, just this sort of contingency argument. But my thought has expanded on that. I think there's actually, within the sort of family of contingency type arguments, there's a couple of different paths now that I think are successful and that I've been exploring lately. I think they're related in important ways, and maybe we could explore those relationships a little bit. But no, yeah, I'm a big fan of this type of argument. I think it is a good argument. I think it's a very powerful argument, and it's an important argument because it essentially tries to answer the question, how come anything, right? Sometimes you hear, why is there something rather than nothing? That's a pretty big question. And if you think that question is meaningful and you think that question is interesting, then it's the tradition of contingency type of arguments that try to account for that try to answer that big question.
Right. Now, was that Mortimer Adler's, he felt that was the one, successful argument that convinced him was the why is there anything contingency argument?
Yeah, so he's got this book called How to Think About God, and it was, in fact, one of the first books I read in natural theology. And by natural theology, we mean, just using reason to try and reach a theological conclusion. So it's separate from revealed theology. It's really a philosophical discipline. And what Adler does in that book is he says, look, there's all these traditional arguments for God, and he does look at some of Aquinas's, and he presents some objections to them. Objections which I thought sounded pretty good at the time, but as I went deeper into Aquinas, I actually think Adler was wrong on those points. But setting that aside, he then later presents his own version of the contingency argument. And what he does is he argues that the universe is sort of radically contingent. And we know this because it could have been otherwise, right? And he kind of holds to this basic explanatory principle that anything that could have been otherwise could not have been at all. And it does, in fact, demand an account of why it is, in fact, right? So kind of in the background for Adler is some sort of explanatory principle based on this deep intuition that we have that the universe could have been otherwise. And that itself signifies the universe's contingency or need for an extrinsic explanation of why it is rather than not. And it's an interesting book. I think it's a good book. I don't articulate or defend the contingency argument in the way that Adler does specifically, but I owe a lot to Adler because he got me really thinking about this. He was one of the first guys that really got me thinking about natural theology and arguments for the existence of God and stuff like that. So I still very much recommend his book on the topic. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, I always, for some reason, that always stuck with me. I thought it was interesting that he thought that was the most successful of the ways, but I agree with you too. He got Aquinas wrong in a couple areas. But anyway, enough about that. Let's talk about what areas do you see as promising lines of argument in contingency umbrella?
Yeah, I think one way to think about it is to divide it into two families of contingency argument. And maybe we should start with some just basic introductory ideas. When we talk about something being contingent, we just are really saying that something is, but it need not have been. Right.
Okay.
It doesn't really sort of explain itself. It's not self-explanatory, especially concerning its existence. Right. So lots of contingent things. I've got this coffee. It's contingent. I'm contingent. Yngwie Malmsteen, one of my favorite guitarists. He's awesome. Yep. We're glad he's here, but he didn't have to be. Right. So the way I like to think about contingency arguments is either in the tradition of Leibniz or in the tradition of Thomas Aquinas. And the tradition of Leibniz kind of proceeds like this. Leibniz will say, look, there's something that's true about the world, and that something is that things have an adequate explanation, right, for why they are. Actually, Leibniz is stronger about this. He holds a very strong notion of what's called the principle of sufficient reason. But people following Leibniz say at least some version of what's called the principle of sufficient reason is true, and maybe modestly would say that anything that exists has an adequate reason for its existence, and that will either be due to that thing's sort of internal nature, if it has a very sort of special nature that can explain its own existence, or some sort of extrinsic cause, right? And the way these types of arguments work is they'll first sort of explain this explanatory principle, and then they will often defend it and say, here's why this explanatory principle is true, and then they will apply it. So they might say, okay, there's an explanatory principle, and it demands that all contingent things, anything of the type contingent, is a sort of thing that requires an extrinsic cause or explanation or what have you, right? And then they'll take that principle and they'll kind of mush together all the contingent facts and things, right? And say, look, the only thing that can explain why there's anything of the type contingent is something that itself cannot be contingent, and that just leaves us with a necessary thing, right? So this is sort of like stage one of cosmological reasoning. Contingent things have a cause, smush them all together, apply the explanatory principle. There must be a necessary thing. Otherwise, there would be no contingent things. But there are contingent things, so there must be a necessary thing. But then you sort of have to do further work to establish that necessary thing is God. So oftentimes in the contemporary literature, these sort of Leibnizian style cosmological arguments are broken out into those two phases. One is moving from the contingent to the necessary, and that often involves a lot of defense of this explanatory principle and then applying it, and then, getting around other objections that may come up, like what about infinite regress and stuff like that. We can talk about that here in a minute if we want. And then it's like, okay, well, even if there is a necessary thing, why should we think that thing is God, right? And then that's where you kind of do all the moves that Aquinas, but Leibniz also does as well, to show, well, to be a necessary thing would demand having a very special sort of nature. If we follow Aquinas, its nature would just have to be the sort of thing whose essence just is its existence, that exists in the most robust way possible, in a way that's automatically actual. And then as the sort of cause of everything else that could exist, we can start to infer things like omnipotence, and there's other moves you can make to get to omniscience and perfect goodness and stuff like that. It takes more metaphysical unpacking, and we can do that later on. Let me just get the sketch on the table. But the point is that thinkers in this tradition, both of these, the Leibnizian and the Thomistic one, they do give arguments for why this necessary thing, or the thing that's explaining all the contingent things, not just probably is God, but in fact must possess divine attributes to be a necessary thing, right? Otherwise, it would slip back into that category of caused being, right? Mm-hmm. So that's the Leibnizian approach. And again, just to summarize, it sort of begins with a general explanatory principle, applies it to a sort of class of beings or entities, typically contingent beings, right? But there's other formulations as well. Gets something else sort of proven, if you will, like a necessary being, and then argues why that necessary being must be God. That's that approach. The Thomistic approach, and this is where my thought has developed on this, Gary, is I used to thought, well, the Thomistic approach sort of is the Leibnizian approach, but Aquinas wasn't really explicit about the PSR. It's sort of just running in the background. So that's just really, they're all just sort of the same argument at the end of the day. I actually don't think that anymore. I think there's versions of Thomistic arguments that definitely do either assume or even outright defend the PSR. I actually think on Thomas's worldview, you can run an argument to God that does not depend on the PSR, does not require you to defend up front some sort of broad explanatory principle, but it does require you to see the world metaphysically the way that Thomas Aquinas does, right? So either way, you're going to have your work cut out for you, right? Either you're going to have to defend your explanatory principle up front, or you're going to have to do some metaphysics up front, which will then kind of set you up for a demonstration for God's existence. And just to sketch how I think this works with Aquinas, Aquinas is committed to what's sometimes known as a constituent ontology. He thinks that beings like us, Gary, finite, contingent beings, are actual metaphysical composites, right? That we have an essence part our sort of what part, our what determination, right, that accounts for what we are. But we also have an existence part. And the existence part is what sort of makes our essence actual, if you will. I hear the music coming up, so I'll hit pause there before I get too deeper into this, because it would be annoying to go any further.
Right, exactly. We're chatting with Pat Flynn, talking about the contingency argument. More to come right after this. Stay tuned.